What would happen if all our material desires were satisfied? Throughout the decades from the 1950s to the 1970s, the ethologist John Calhoun conducted a series of experiments to study the effects of overpopulation on social behavior. The most famous of these experiments became known as Universe 25. In it, Calhoun created a closed and carefully controlled environment inhabited by mice, designed to function as a true utopia. In this environment, there were no predators, no diseases, nor any scarcity of resources. Food and water, never lacking, temperature, ideal and stable, space for nests and shelters, plentiful. In other words, all the basic material needs of these rodents were fully satisfied. The only truly limiting factor was what came to be called social space, the web of interactions among individuals. Universe 25 began with only 4 pairs of mice, all healthy. In the first months, their behavior was considered normal. The animals explored the environment, established territories, and began to reproduce. As the population grew, the birth rate increased rapidly. The number of individuals doubled at ever shorter intervals. However, as population density increased, profound changes in behavior began to emerge. The social hierarchy broke down. Aggressiveness increased. Behaviors considered pathological became frequent. Many females began to abandon or attack their offspring. Many males proved incapable of defending their territory or establishing stable social relationships. Society seemed to collapse. A particularly striking phenomenon occurred: the appearance of a group nicknamed the Beautiful Ones. These mice had perfect physical appearance but exhibited total social isolation. They did not compete for space, did not mate, and showed no interest in collective interactions. Over time, reproduction practically ceased throughout the colony, even though resources were still abundant. The final phase was an irreversible population decline. Society entered complete collapse and eventually became extinct. The utopia, in the end, seemed to be a dystopia. For Calhoun, the experiment demonstrated that a population can collapse not because of a lack of material resources, but because of the disintegration of its social and behavioral bonds, a process he called behavioral death. Another conclusion that many drew from this experiment is that overpopulation inevitably leads to social disintegration. We saw that, with increasing population density, pathological behaviors appeared. Increased aggressiveness, abandonment of offspring, cannibalism, social isolation, and the loss of normal reproductive behaviors. According to some, this is evidence that densely populated societies tend toward chaos, regardless of material abundance. This interpretation gained traction in debates about human population growth, especially in the context of the 1960s and 1970s, when fear of a demographic explosion was high. Another conclusion many reached was that societal collapse was a consequence of the mice's excess of freedom. But what about from a libertarian point of view? How can we interpret this experiment? From that perspective, a first essential caution is to reject the simplistic reading that the experiment proves the inevitability of social collapse with high population density. Universe 25 was not a free society. On the contrary, it was an artificially planned system, totally centralized and without any possibility of exit. The mice could not migrate, innovate, create new spontaneous rules, or reorganize space according to their needs. Order was imposed from the top down, without mechanisms for decentralized adaptation. Thus, the observed collapse can be interpreted not as a consequence of excess freedom, as many claim, but precisely of its absence. Another central point to analyze is the notion of guaranteed abundance. In Universe 25, resources, food, water, and shelter were provided automatically, regardless of individual behavior. From a libertarian perspective, this eliminates the role of incentives and individual responsibility. In human societies, social cooperation emerges precisely from the need for exchange, production, and specialization. In the experiment, there was no need to cooperate to survive, nor were there clear rewards for productive or socially useful behaviors. The result was the progressive erosion of social roles in the colony, something libertarians often associate with systems in which rewards are detached from merit or contribution. Incentives become completely distorted. The phenomenon of behavioral death can also be reinterpreted as a crisis of meaning, not merely of population density. Consider the following. In a libertarian society, the variety of life projects, voluntary associations, and emerging norms allows individuals to find distinct social niches. In Universe 25, however, all the mice were trapped in a single model of spatial and social organization. When this model became saturated, no alternatives existed. From a libertarian point of view, this reinforces the importance of voluntary institutions, competition among forms of organization, and the freedom to experiment with different social arrangements. In other words, order should be spontaneous, bottom-up, not imposed from the top down. The figure of the beautiful ones is especially revealing through a libertarian lens. These individuals were the product of an environment in which the cost of disengaging socially was practically zero, something libertarians have long warned about. In highly interventionist societies, there is a very high risk that people become dependent, apathetic, or socially withdrawn when their basic needs are guaranteed without any counterpart, a kind of welfare state. The isolation of these beautiful mice can be seen as an extreme version of this process. Individuals who survive biologically but completely withdraw from social, productive, and reproductive life. Since there was no relationship between action and consequence, there were no incentives for them to interact with one another. Moreover, the environment did not allow for territorial differentiation. Although there was space, there was no real property. No mouse could control, defend, or adapt an area. Without property, there is no responsibility. Behaviors degenerate. The aggressiveness observed in the experiment can be seen as a chaotic struggle for power in a system where natural signals of merit had been erased. Another fundamental point is the absence of freedom of exit. The mice had nowhere to escape. In a free society, individuals can leave dysfunctional environments, migrate, create new communities, or experiment with different social arrangements. But there, everyone was subjected to the same flawed arrangement, like in a highly centralized state from which one cannot escape. The Universe 25 experiment does not demonstrate the failure of freedom, but the failure of planned utopianism. It shows that imposed material comfort, without real freedom, without diversity of arrangements, and without organic incentives, leads to decay. It is an indirect critique of the idea that a central authority can design a perfect environment and thereby solve social problems. The complexity of behavior emerges from free interactions, not from planning. Prosperity does not depend solely on material abundance. It involves freedom, responsibility, property, institutional diversity, and the possibility of adaptation. In short, societies cannot be treated as engineering projects. When they are, even the most comfortable environments can produce the most dehumanizing outcomes.